And in case you've forgotten, since it's been so long, we are 5 weeks into our exploration of the most famous sermon ever preached, which we now call today the Sermon on the Mount. And in this sermon, Jesus shares some of the most remarkable and relevant teaching that you'll find anywhere in Scripture. None, I think, more relevant than the section we're going to look at today, but we'll get to that in just a moment. The sermon, in case, again, you've forgotten, begins with the Beatitudes, where Jesus describes the character traits of truly happy people. He says, "Blessed are thee," and then fill in the blank, for 8 different Beatitudes there. And then he moves on and he gives this great compliment and commission to his followers, calling them the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And that's a calling that we need to live up to, but also a compliment where he praises his followers. And then after that, he establishes his relationship with the Old Testament or the Old Covenant by talking about how he has come to complete or fulfill that covenant. And he says that as a preface to the rest of the sermon, or at least the next big chunk of the sermon, because he then goes on to quote a command from the Old Testament and then give a sort of fresh application for that commandment. First, he deals with one of the most common problems plaguing people of any generation, and that's anger. Jesus starts with the command, "Thou shalt not commit murder," and then he warns that unchecked anger often leads to harsh words and hindered worship, and so he urges us to heal the wounds caused by our anger by seeking reconciliation and forgiveness. And this morning, as we continue through the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tackles some touchy and often taboo topics, all of which are tethered to the sanctity of marriage. So if you have a Bible or an app on your phone and you want to follow along this morning, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 5, and we'll be reading verses 27 through 37. So Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 through 37. It's 3 different paragraphs in most Bibles. And in these 3 paragraphs, as I said, Jesus touches on 3 topics that are all tied to marriage. First, Jesus addresses the issue of sexual depravity, or sexual immorality, as the NIV phrases it. Earlier, Jesus cited that command, "Thou shalt not murder," and then he expanded that command to include the attitudes and actions like name-calling and cursing that often precede murder. And here he does the same thing with another one of the 10 commandments, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." And here's what he says, beginning in verse 27 and going on through verse 30. He says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell." Now, adultery, for those not familiar with the terminology, is sex between a married person and a person who is not his or her spouse. So, in other words, adultery always involves at least one, if not both people, cheating on their husband or wife. And many men today, as well as in Jesus' day, could read the 10 Commandments and say, well, I've never committed adultery, so I'm a pretty good husband. And Jesus says, not so fast. He says, if you've even looked at a woman lustfully, you're just as guilty. And I honestly believe that there has never been a time when this statement is more relevant. Technology has made it convenient and inconspicuous for men to look lustfully at women to their heart's content. I mean, you can hardly go online or turn on the TV without being bombarded by sexual images. Pornography is a $13 billion a year business, and it's everywhere today. 1 in 8 online searches, that's over 12%, is for pornography. And in fact, according to Pornhub, which is one of the world's largest providers of pornography online, 72% of pornography is now viewed on smartphones and tablets, which means you can just take it with you anywhere you go. And increasing numbers of people are viewing pornography on game consoles like Xbox and PlayStation. And a lot of people believe that the reason for the rise in that is because you're getting a lot of younger boys who don't yet have cell phones, but have access to game consoles in their bedrooms or in their private areas where they can look at pornography. And so if you have kids that have game consoles in their rooms or things like that, you might want to check and monitor what they're looking at. But according to a 2014 survey, 64% of men view porn at least once a month, and many of them as often as every single day. And Christians are not immune to this either. The same survey showed that 54% of born-again Christian men confess to viewing pornography at least once a month. That's over half of self-identified Christians. And of course, viewing pornography goes hand in hand with self-gratification. That's what Jesus is hinting toward here. Maybe you didn't pick up on it the first time, but Jesus starts off by describing, looking at a woman with lust, committing adultery in your heart. And then he transitions to saying that your eye causes you to sin, and your hand, specifically your right hand, causes you to sin. Is everybody tracking with me? We know what we're talking about? I'm trying to avoid certain words for family friendliness, but everybody knows what Jesus is saying here. He's talking about gratifying yourself at the thought or image of a woman other than your wife. And even though you're not literally committing adultery, Jesus is putting that sin in the same category as adultery, just like he put uncontrolled anger in the same category as murder. So what's the solution? Well, Jesus says to pluck out your eye and cut off your hand. Of course, Jesus doesn't mean that literally. If he did, there would be a whole lot of Christian men walking around blind with only one hand. So Jesus is using hyperbole here, intentionally exaggerating in order to emphasize how important it is to cut this sin out of your life. Now, let me be really open with you for a minute. My father was addicted to pornography when I was a kid. And in fact, when I was 12 or 13 years old, I was exposed to pornography because of him. I was writing a paper for school, and this was before, USB drives or the cloud. So I had to save my paper to a 3.5-inch floppy disk. Anybody remember those? Kind of dating myself a little bit here. But I didn't have any blank disks at my computer, so I went downstairs to my dad's computer and I rifled through all his stuff until I found a disk with no label on it, which I assumed was blank. But I took it up to my room and I popped it in the computer to discover that it was full of pornographic pictures. And I'm ashamed to admit that at 12, 13 years old, whatever I was mesmerized by that. I had never seen this kind of stuff before. And so I kept it. I hid it in my room. And a few weeks later, my dad was installing some new software or something on my computer, and he found the disk. And the only thing that he said to me about it was, "Let's not tell your mother about this." And from that point on, I struggled with pornography all through high school and college. And it really wasn't until Ashley came into my life that I was set free from that sin. Ashley had a zero tolerance policy. She's like, if I catch you looking at porn, we're done, period. And so thanks to her influence, I did exactly what Jesus tells us to do here. I didn't cut off my hand or my eye, obviously, but I cut off the internet. And this was before smartphones, so I didn't have, the internet on my phone. We didn't have any internet at home, and so I placed that temptation out of arm's length, where it wasn't easily accessible. And I did that for 2 years, first 2 years of our marriage. And so thanks to Ashley's influence and to God's grace, that kept me accountable, and that sin hasn't been a part of my life for over 15 years. And I share that story to tell you that if you're struggling with pornography, my suggestion is that you do the same thing. Cut it off at the source, whether that means turning off the internet or throwing out your cell phone. And you have to have somebody that you trust, whether it's your wife or your best friend or maybe your pastor, that can keep you accountable. It may be impossible to completely avoid sexual temptations, but thankfully it is not impossible to overcome them. And unfortunately, even when we do avoid sexual depravity and immorality and maintain our purity, many marriages still end in senseless divorce. Senseless divorce is the next thing Jesus talks about. He transitions in these next paragraphs, moves from the idea of committing adultery through depraved lust to committing adultery through divorce. He says in verse 31 and following, "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." So Jesus makes some complex and controversial statements here that kind of go against the grain of our own culture, that requires some historical background to unpack. In the Old Testament, both men and women had the right to divorce their spouses. Exodus 21:10 specifically gives women the right to divorce their husband if he denied her or did not provide her with food, clothing, or sexual intimacy. If he withheld any of those three things, a woman had the right to divorce her husband. However, that wasn't a very common occurrence, because in ancient Israel, just like in most cultures, men were landowners and women were not. So for a woman to divorce her husband meant that she would have to then leave the home and the land, typically with no money and no place to go. So that didn't happen too often. Men, on the other hand, because they were the landowners, when they divorced their wives, they would send their wives away. They would get to keep the house and the land, and the woman would just have to go off on her own. And the only thing that she took with her was this certificate of divorce. The law of Moses, which Jesus refers to here in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, said, "If a man marries a woman, but she becomes displeasing to him because he finds something improper about her, he may write her a divorce certificate, hand it to her, and send her away from his house." Now, the divorce certificate was very important, and it was a very simple document. Generally, it just said, "I divorce this woman," fill in her name, and she is free to marry whomever she wishes. The divorce certificate confirmed that she was in fact divorced, and she had the legal right to remarry. Without that certificate, she could not enter into a new relationship without committing adultery, because she would still be legally married to her first husband. So Moses required that men give their wives this certificate so she would have proof to show somebody and say, "Yes, I can get married. I'm not married to that person anymore." And that was a way of taking care of, ensuring her safety, that she wasn't then just out on the street and nobody could start a relationship with her. Controversy arose, however, over this somewhat ambiguous phrase, "something improper." The Hebrew there is evrat debar, and it literally means a thing of nakedness. It's not a whole lot more helpful, is it? But traditionally, Jewish rabbis interpreted this to mean sexual immorality. In other words, if a man finds out that his wife is cheating on him, he would have the right to divorce her and send her away. However, in the first century, by Jesus' day, this prominent Jewish teacher, Rabbi Hillel, took the phrase "something improper" to mean that a man could divorce his wife for any reason at all. He actually claimed that a man could justify divorcing his wife if she displeased him because she spoiled the supper. If she burned the toast or the pot roast, he had justifiable reasons to just send her packing. And this teaching, not surprisingly, became very popular among first century men, and divorce rates skyrocketed. Now, Jesus clearly sided with the traditional interpretation of Deuteronomy 24:1 because he cites sexual immorality as the legitimate cause for divorce in that passage. But he goes a step further and he adds, let's look at this again, verse 31 and 32. "But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness," so unless you catch her cheating, "causes her to become an adulteress, and anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery." So what Jesus is saying is that senselessly divorcing their wives for frivolous reasons is no different than sending them packing without that much needed divorce certificate. In other words, the divorce certificates they were writing were garbage because they were worthless because they were writing them for senseless, frivolous reasons. And now I know that this ought to, I think, open up a whole classroom full of questions. Curious Christians wonder, well, are there any other legitimate reasons for divorce? Or if I'm already divorced, can I ever get remarried again? If I've got a divorce for illegitimate reasons, can I be forgiven, and even if I can't be reconciled to my ex? And the answer to all of those questions, by the way, is yes. The Bible speaks to those issues in other passages. In fact, the Apostle Paul devotes an entire chapter to the subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. But here in this passage, Jesus is employing hyperbole to emphasize his point. Divorce and remarriage is not literally adultery any more than lusting with your eyes is literally adultery. But I don't want to water down what Jesus is saying. His point remains just as valid today as it was back then. And the point is, stop senseless divorces. God intended marriage to last a lifetime, and far too many marriages end in divorce. And again, this is something I know firsthand because I've been there. I was married when I was 19, still in college, and I was divorced 4 years later. And like a lot of stupid guys, I didn't see it coming. I knew that there were problems in that marriage, but when she just packed up and moved out one day, I had no idea it was coming. And I did my best to try and reconcile and restore our marriage, but in the end, her mind was made up, and there was nothing that I could do. And I think a lot of people wind up in that boat either because they blind themselves to issues or they're just really not paying attention to what's going on. But you know why so many marriages end in divorce? Jesus actually addresses it elsewhere. In Matthew 19, a couple of Pharisees ask him, they say directly, why did Moses say a man could give his wife a divorce certificate and send her away? Why did Moses allow that? And Jesus replies in verse 8, he says, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts, but it was not what God had originally intended. Hard-heartedness is the root cause of every divorce. When your heart grows hard toward the person that you once loved, you start looking for the door. But that's not what God intended. Instead, what God intended for marriage is steadfast devotion. After discussing sexual depravity and senseless divorces, Jesus provides the solution to both of these problems, which is steadfast devotion. He goes on and he says in verse 33 through 37, again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your own head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is yes or no. Now, obviously, this passage has broader application than just marriage alone. It applies to every aspect of life, but I'm convinced that Jesus goes straight from the subject of marital unfaithfulness to keeping your word, because there's a direct correlation there. In Jesus' day, people commonly made oaths and vows. Although God's word took these oaths very seriously, the Pharisees and other religious leaders of Jesus' day had concocted this kind of convoluted system of determining just how binding an oath really was. If they made the oath, they swore by heaven, or they swore by Jerusalem, or they swore by their own head, or any of these other things, then they didn't really have to keep the oath if they didn't want to. It was kind of like the equivalent of crossing your fingers when you make a promise. You cross your fingers, hide them behind your back, and then you can lie all you want because you're not really intending to keep this promise. And that was the idea. But Jesus' point here is that a promise is a promise no matter what words are used. No matter how you phrase it, when you say you're going to do something, you need to do it. Yes means yes, no means no. People need to be able to count on you and depend on you. If you say you're going to do it, then do it. And when it comes to our marriages, when you say, I do it. Each and every couple here that's married made a series of promises on their wedding day. And it's usually something along the lines of, I, husband, take you, wife, to be my lawfully wedded wife or husband, and to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, forsaking all others, till death do us part. And it doesn't matter whether you got married in a church or in a courtroom or in a living room, those words, whatever variation of them you used, matter. Those vows matter. It's a promise made to your spouse in the presence of God. And God wants each of us to be men and women of our word, to be steadfast and devoted to our promises and to that person. And I would encourage each and every couple to periodically reread and review their wedding vows. Ask yourself, ask your spouse, how am I holding up my commitment? How am I doing when it comes to these promises I've made you? We live in a world that says life is short, have an affair. Literally, that's the tagline on Ashley Madison's website. But when this life is over and we stand on the cusp of eternity, we want to hear Jesus say, as he said in Matthew chapter 25, verse 23, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful and trustworthy. Share in the joy of your master." See, in God's economy, steadfast devotion, being a man or woman of your word who follows through with your promises, is a valuable virtue that reaps real rewards. And when it comes to sex and marriage, Jesus tells us that sexual depravity, looking at another woman lustfully, is detrimental to our righteousness and our relationships. He also tells us that there are some legitimate reasons to separate, but Christians should never be looking for the back door. We shouldn't be seeking senseless divorces. Instead, we ought to demonstrate steadfast devotion, remaining faithful to the vows and the promises that we've made. And I hope that you can see just how relatable and relevant the Sermon on the Mount still is to your life and mine. And next week, we're going to delve a little bit deeper into this matchless message. But right now, if you've been struggling with pornography, or your marriage is hanging on by a thread and you're thinking about forsaking your vows, listen, one sermon isn't going to solve all your problems or give you all the answers that you need. Marriage can be messy, but I'd like to help. I have this wonderful marriage seminar that I use for premarital counseling called Laugh Your Way to a Better Marriage. Some of you here have actually sat down and watched it with me, and it is terribly uncomfortable to talk about this stuff in a living room with your pastor. But it isn't just for newlyweds. In fact, the longer you've been married, the more relevant you'll find it. It deals with all this kind of stuff and much, much more. And I won't ask you to come forward now in front of everybody. Of course, you can if the Spirit moves you to do so. But I do want to encourage you to pull me aside after church, or just call me at home, or stop by the church office sometime this week so that we can talk. And in the meantime, let's all stand up and worship together. Let's sing, church.